At 11:43 p.m., my phone pulsed against the nightstand, lighting up my half-dark room in Minneapolis. My dad sent, "We changed all the locks. You don't have a home anymore. Let's see how brave you are now, haha." I stared at the screen until my reflection blurred into the glass. The words didn't sound like anger. They sounded like victory. That small ha-ha that was the sound of someone enjoying the wreckage. The radiator hissed behind me, and the snow outside pressed against the window like a quiet audience. I sat there, knees pulled to my chest, realizing that this wasn't just a message, it was a declaration. A confirmation that the line between us had been severed, and he had cut it himself. I, Marina Holt, had been gone for 3 months, long enough to stop hoping for an apology, but not long enough to stop expecting another blow. My father, Richard Holt, always believed silence was control. Tonight, he upgraded to cruelty. My thumb hovered over the screen before I saved a screenshot into a folder labeled Evidence. Not for nostalgia, for survival. You never know when you'll need proof of what someone pretends never happened. 2 days later, an email arrived from their attorney. "We have a problem. Call immediately." I didn't call. Problems had been my family's specialty for decades. This one I wanted to watch unfold. Somewhere between the snow and the silence, I realized this wasn't just the end of a family, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to see what justice might cost. Would you stand up to your own family if the truth tore everything apart? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for the next chapter of this true family revenge story. There is a kind of silence that grows inside a family, one that hums beneath every dinner conversation and every polite smile. I learned that silence early. My father, Richard Holt, used it like a tool, and my mother, Elaine Holt, followed the rhythm of his quiet expectations. Their son, Ryan Holt, never had to listen to that silence at all. He was the melody they cared to hear. When we were children, fairness wasn't measured by love, it was measured by access. Ryan had the newest bicycle, the upgraded computer, the space by the window in the bigger room. I learned to fit myself into corners to be the child who didn't ask. Asking always sounded like confrontation, and confrontation made my father's voice go still in a way that could chill the whole house. I remember birthdays as proof of hierarchy, his cakes tall and decorated, mine small and hurried. His allowance doubled each summer, while I was reminded that girls should learn gratitude. It was never said with cruelty, only certainty, which somehow made it worse. Certainty leaves no space for protest. When college came, Ryan's tuition check cleared in full before he packed. My acceptance letter to the University of Minnesota came with a spreadsheet, my own calculation of scholarships and loans. I worked nights at a cafe and weekends at a library, convincing myself that independence was strength, not abandonment. Loans build character. My father once said after I told him I was short on rent. He didn't mean it as comfort, he meant it as philosophy. I watched Ryan drift through semesters like someone immune to consequence. When he dropped out to find himself, they called it maturity. When I asked for help to cover textbooks, they called it entitlement. Every decision he made became a story of growth. Every one of mine became a lesson in humility. Over time, I stopped asking for fairness and started recording proof of its absence. Little things. The email where Mom said, "We're so proud of Ryan's courage to take a break." The check my father signed to buy him a used car. The message where Mom reminded me to stay practical. They didn't feel like memories. They felt like exhibits in a case no one intended to try. By my senior year, I'd stopped visiting home altogether. It was easier to send updates than to face the questions behind every polite pause. Ryan sent selfies from his trips, his wrist glinting with the watch Dad gave him for staying grounded. I didn't even own a car. Still, I built something small and mine, a degree, a career, an apartment paid for with long hours and caffeine. The strange thing about surviving unfairness is that it teaches precision. You learn to notice what people believe they deserve. You learn how love becomes conditional, how approval becomes currency. You learn that family pride often hides its debts. When I look back now, I don't see a childhood at all. I see a slow apprenticeship in erasure. Every time I was overlooked, something sharper grew underneath, quiet, but alive. By the time I left that house, I wasn't escaping. I was rehearsing. Because somewhere beneath all the silence, I had learned one dangerous skill from my father: how to wait, and waiting, when mixed with clarity, can become its own form of power. Sunday came dressed as a celebration. The table shimmered with silverware that only appeared for milestones. and the smell of roasted meat carried through every room as if pretending that warmth could erase tension. I remember standing in the doorway, coat still on, wondering when family gathering had started to feel like surveillance. Madison Gray, my brother's fiancée, smiled first. Her kind of beauty always seemed aware of itself, polished to please the gaze of the room. Ryan Holt sat beside her, his arm draped around the back of her chair like possession disguised as affection. Across from them, my parents Richard and Elaine Holt looked proud in a way that made the air heavy. Dinner began with small talk that floated above us like harmless clouds. Weather, work, the renovations at the lakehouse near Mill Lacs. That last word snapped something quiet inside me. The lakehouse had been my grandmother's sanctuary, wood walls filled with her humming, her journals, her warnings about pride. She used to tell us, "That house belongs to every grandchild. Keep it fair, keep it honest." I almost believed her. As plates emptied, my father cleared his throat. It was the sound he used before delivering announcements rather than news. He lifted his glass and said they had decided to gift the lake house to Ryan and Madison as their wedding present. The words landed with the softness of a hammer. No one looked at me, which told me everything. My mother's eyes stayed on her napkin. Ryan traced circles on Madison's hand, pretending modesty. I didn't speak. I only watched the candlelight bend in the glass, and realized this was not a dinner, it was a rehearsal of hierarchy. Fairness had not died tonight, it had simply been formalized. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the one that comes from years of swallowing what should have been said. There was no surprise, only confirmation. My father had built his empire on control. This was his monument to himself, carved out of inheritance. The clinking of silverware became unbearable. My pulse grew louder than conversation. I imagined my grandmother's voice echoing through those wooden rooms, the smell of her soap, the neat handwriting in her will. Somewhere in a drawer, there had to be her intentions, something that proved this theft was more than betrayal. It was a violation. I rose from my seat without a word. Chairs shifted. The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was recognition. They had always known I would not accept their version of gratitude. My mother's hand twitched as if to reach for me, but habit kept her still. My father watched, his expression unreadable, satisfied in the way only victors are. Walking to the door, I felt the air cool against my skin, sharper than I expected. The house behind me hummed with laughter as I stepped outside, the kind of laughter that fills in the spaces truth leaves behind. I didn't turn back. On the drive home, Minneapolis lights blurred against the windshield. My hands trembled not from loss but from something colder, clearer. I wasn't leaving in defeat. I was documenting the moment they made honesty impossible. That kind of clarity doesn't fade, it calcifies. When I reached my apartment, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. If they treat fairness as fiction, I'll remind them that evidence is not. I closed the cover, felt the weight of the words, and knew the story of my family had just split into two versions, the one they told, and the one I would prove. Sometimes, truth doesn't reveal itself, it waits, patient and deliberate, until you're steady enough to face it. That moment came for me on a gray afternoon, the kind of day when the world feels slightly blurred. I was at my desk at Harlow and Reed Accounting, combing through tax files for a commercial client, when a memory brushed against me like static, my grandmother's voice, saying she had written everything down. I opened my browser before I could second-guess the impulse, and searched her name, Margaret Holt. Her obituary appeared first, followed by archived property records. Among them, a listing for the Mill Lacs Lake House still showed her name. No transfer, no sale, no trust adjustment. A glitch, maybe, or proof. My pulse picked up. I followed the trail until I found something more solid, a reference to Thomas Avery, the attorney who had handled her estate. His office was only 40 minutes away. Logic told me to leave it alone, but logic had kept me quiet for years. I closed my laptop, grabbed my coat, and left. His office smelled of cedar and dust, the scent of old paper and long-kept promises. When I mentioned my grandmother's name, recognition flickered across his eyes. He searched through files, fingers careful, then paused. "There was a will update," he said, voice low. "Your grandmother created a shared trust for her grandchildren, equal beneficiaries. The property couldn't be transferred without unanimous consent." I didn't speak. The room seemed to narrow around me. Equal beneficiaries. The phrase pulsed in my head like a siren. He handed me a certified copy of the trust. I saw the signatures. Margaret Holt, Richard Holt, and Elaine Holt witnessed, notarized, clear as daylight. Outside, the air felt sharper, as if the sky itself had shifted weight. I drove home in silence, the document seat belted beside me like a passenger. Every turn of the wheel tightened something inside my chest. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a theft wrapped in family pride. When I reached my apartment, I laid the papers across the table, smoothing the creases. My hands were steady, almost calm. The evidence was clean, indisputable, and older than the version they must have filed after her death. Somewhere between grief and greed, my parents had replaced the truth with convenience. That night I sat by the window, watching snow settle over the city, and tried to map out the weight of what I held. The numbers, the signatures, the sequence of dates, it all added up to something I could finally quantify: betrayal, in legal form. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned out, leaving precision in its place. Years of accounting had trained me to find patterns in chaos, to reconcile what others tried to hide. They had always underestimated that skill, assuming my quietness was submission. It never was. I printed duplicates, stored the originals in a folder, and began cataloging supporting evidence, emails, statements, photos of the lakehouse. Proof stacked neatly, row after row, like balance sheets closing in on a truth that could no longer be denied. By midnight, my apartment floor was covered in papers. It looked less like a home and more like a case file. A strange calm settled over me. For the first time, I didn't feel like their daughter. I felt like an auditor, someone tasked with exposing the cost of dishonesty. When I finally turned off the lights, one thought settled quietly but firmly in my mind. They had spent a lifetime teaching me to accept imbalance. Now, they would learn what happens when the forgotten child learns the language of proof. The next step revealed itself not through anger but through method. Order had always been my refuge, and this was arithmetic disguised as justice. I began with structure. Copies of every document, timestamps, email chains, notarized signatures. Each item found its place in a growing binder labeled Only Estate Inquiry. Precision, I realized, was a quiet form of rebellion. At Harlow and Reed, I worked late, my spreadsheets open like blueprints for a war no one else could see. Between ledgers, I researched legal terms that once seemed distant: probate fraud, executor removal, breach of fiduciary duty. They weren't words of vengeance. They were vocabulary for truth. Still, I needed counsel. Thomas Avery, the estate attorney, agreed to meet again. His office felt different now, tense, expectant. When I showed him the original trust alongside the fraudulent filing my parents had submitted, his eyes narrowed. He didn't need convincing. He began outlining procedures, deadlines, and consequences with the calm precision of someone sharpening a blade. Filing a petition meant exposure. It meant my name would sit opposite my parents in a public record. For a moment, I hesitated. But hesitation had never stopped them. It had only paralyzed me. I signed. The paper felt heavier than its weight. That night, I drafted a letter to my aunt, Linda Carver, my father's estranged sister. She had stopped attending family gatherings years ago, long before the silence turned hostile. I remembered her once whispering that Grandma Margaret's will had been tampered with. Maybe she had seen what I was only now proving. Her reply came the next morning, a short message that began, "I was waiting for this." She confirmed everything. She had witnessed the original signing, and she had suspected for years that my father had filed an outdated version to seize full control. Her words weren't vindictive, just tired, the kind of exhaustion born from knowing the truth and watching others rewrite it. Within a week, Avery and Associates filed the official complaint with the Hennepin County Probate Court. The motion accused Richard Holt of fraudulent filing and sought to restore the property to its rightful trust. Legal action transformed the quiet betrayal into something quantifiable, measurable, provable. My parents' reaction arrived not through conversation but through consequence. They froze my childhood savings account and removed me from the family insurance policy. My father's final act of control was to withdraw comfort, an old tactic that had once worked. It didn't this time. Comfort was no longer my currency. At work, I found refuge in numbers. They made sense when nothing else did. My boss, Janet Lowell, noticed the shift. She said nothing, but her quiet respect was louder than pity. I focused on every formula, every account reconciliation, every tangible piece of progress, because truth, like accounting, thrives in precision. Weeks passed under the rhythm of filings, affidavits, and counterclaims. Then the first hearing was scheduled. I received the notice folded in legal stationery, my name printed beside theirs. Seeing it in ink made the conflict undeniable. That night, I stood in front of my mirror, studying the reflection of someone I barely recognized. The softness was gone, replaced by a kind of steadiness I hadn't earned through love but through survival. There was no triumph, only inevitability. My father's world had been built on unchallenged authority. Mine would be built on documented proof. The storm was already forming, gathering in the quiet corridors of the courthouse, in the hum of scanners and the scratch of pens. By the time I placed the final document into its folder, I knew this wasn't a rebellion. It was an audit of their lies, of my silence, of every imbalance they had enforced. They had built a legacy on control. I would dismantle it with evidence. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Not the kind of cold that comes from weather, but from marble floors and the hum of fluorescent lights that strip warmth from everything. I sat in the waiting area, watching lawyers pass in measured strides, their folders pressed to their chests like armor. For them, this was routine. For me, it was the collision of blood and law. When Judge Marianne Keller entered the courtroom, the quiet shifted. Her presence commanded stillness not with volume, but with certainty. The nameplate in front of her gleamed like judgment itself. My attorney, Thomas Avery, sat beside me, his calm unwavering. Across the aisle, my father and mother sat with their counsel, expressions carved from stone. My brother, Ryan Holt, was there too, his eyes fixed on the floor, loyalty bending under pressure. As the proceedings began, I focused on the sound of paper, pages turning, pens scratching, the metallic click of evidence binders. It was a language I understood better than emotion. Each document was a heartbeat, each signature a confession. The trust, the forged addendum, the dates all aligned like a ledger of deceit. When Avery presented the financial trail, the withdrawals, the account transfers, the discrepancies in estate filings, my father's stillness cracked. Only slightly, but enough. His hand twitched once, then stilled again. Control was slipping, and he felt it. My mother avoided my eyes. I wondered if guilt had a temperature, if it burned or froze. She had chosen silence long ago. Today, that silence sat beside her like an accomplice. The defense argued predictably technical errors, misunderstandings, misplaced paperwork, but the evidence didn't bend. It was linear, precise, irrefutable. When the judge asked if I sought reconciliation, Avery answered for me, "No, Your Honor, only restitution." The words landed with finality. Reconciliation had died the night they changed the locks. The hearing lasted hours, though it felt suspended outside of time. By the end, the judge requested all closing briefs within 10 days. No verdict yet, just procedure. But I could already feel the balance shifting. Walking out of the courthouse, the winter air met me like clarity. The city moved as if nothing had changed, but I knew something fundamental had. For years, I had been the quiet one, the overlooked daughter whose stillness they mistook for weakness. But stillness, I realized, is only silence until it becomes strategy. That evening, I opened my window and let the cold fill the room. Below, Minneapolis glowed with indifferent light. I thought of the lakehouse, its wooden walls, the echo of my grandmother's humming, the promise she wrote into her will. She had trusted fairness to survive. I was making sure it did. A message from Avery and Associates arrived on my phone. Strong position. Expect movement soon. It wasn't victory, but it was momentum. I poured myself a glass of water, hands steady. The fight had become less about inheritance and more about identity. I wasn't reclaiming property, I was reclaiming narrative. In every trial, there's a moment when truth stops whispering and starts demanding to be heard. I was standing at that threshold. Whatever came next, verdict, appeal, exposure, I was ready. Because justice isn't granted, it's assembled, piece by deliberate piece. My father built his empire on fear. I was dismantling it with precision. One affidavit, one signature, one truth at a time. And in that quiet, cold night, I understood something profound. Revenge wasn't fury. It was order restored. Justice didn't arrive with noise. It came in a white envelope delivered to my apartment one quiet afternoon. The court had ruled, the trust reinstated, all property restored under the original terms, my father formally removed as executor. The words were printed in neutral ink, but I could feel the weight they carried. Years of silence condensed into legal recognition, proof that truth, even delayed, still breathes. I didn't cry. There was no celebration, only stillness. I placed the ruling beside the first message he'd sent, the one that began everything. "We changed all the locks." That sentence had once stripped me of a home. Now it read like evidence of who he truly was. The aftermath unfolded slowly, not dramatically. Richard Holt's reputation began to crumble in quiet corners of Minneapolis business circles. Investors pulled back. A fraud investigation followed, not because of me, but because one lie always leads to another. My mother, Elaine, retreated from public life, her name disappearing from the charity boards she once loved. As for Ryan Holt, he moved states away, starting over in anonymity. Families don't collapse at once, they dissolve grain by grain, until nothing familiar remains. The lakehouse was restored to the trust. I drove there alone the following month, the road lined with frozen birch and the quiet hum of distance. When I unlocked the door, the air smelled of wood and memory. My grandmother's handwriting still marked the inside of a kitchen drawer, her lists, her notes, her insistence on fairness. I traced the letters with my hand and understood what legacy truly meant. Not wealth, but integrity. For years, I thought revenge was fire. I thought it would roar, consume, vindicate. But standing in that house, I learned it wasn't destruction. I wanted it was balance. Fire had its place, but justice required precision, not fury. Revenge, in its truest form, was the act of rebuilding what deceit tried to erase. I never spoke to my parents again, not out of spite, but preservation. There are wounds that require distance to heal. Closure didn't arrive through apology, it came through documentation, consequence, and the decision to stop participating in my own erasure. In the months that followed, life became quiet again but not empty. I kept working at Harlow and Reed, took on new clients, and learned the peace of ordinary days. The name Holt no longer echoed like a curse. It was just a name, stripped of its power, reduced to what it always should have been: history. Sometimes, I still drive to Mill Lacs on weekends, bringing a notebook and sitting by the water. The house no longer feels haunted. It feels accounted for. I imagine my grandmother watching, not as a ghost, but as a witness to correction. Every ripple on the lake feels like a signature on the truth. There's a calm that follows justice, a silence that isn't emptiness but equilibrium. People often mistake revenge for rage. They think it burns brighter than grief. But real revenge, the kind that endures, is quiet. It rebuilds, restores, and refuses to disappear. I don't tell this story for pity or triumph. I tell it because families, like systems, fail when accountability is absent. And sometimes, you have to become the auditor of your own bloodline. If I've learned anything, it's this: peace isn't inherited, it's earned through truth, no matter how long it takes to surface. The locks they changed didn't keep me out. They freed me to build a life where honesty had keys of its own. If you believe truth deserves its moment, share your thoughts below. Like, subscribe, and stay for more stories of justice, family, and the courage it takes to reclaim your own narrative.